And I think it was a well-intentioned idea to do a free show. It was a terrible tragedy, and as you say, almost symbolically rounded off the 60s. So they've cleverly repackaged themselves as a touring nostalgia group, but also that gives you these tantalizing glimpses of what they really were when they came out of the gate, which was sensational.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome back to Garage to Stadiums for part 2 of the story of the Rolling Stones. As the 1960s came to a close in December 1969, the Stones were about to be haunted by another tragic chapter. But first, some context. By the close of the 1960s, rock and roll had reshaped culture. Clothes, hair, fashion, sex, all had changed since 1960. Festivals like Woodstock had drawn hundreds of thousands into a dream of peace, love, and freedom. And Mick Jagger and the Stones wanted a piece of that energy for themselves. They planned a free concert in San Francisco at Golden Gate Park, but the city balked. Instead, a remote, hard-to-reach venue with limited access for a large crowd was chosen near Altamont Speedway, a racetrack 55 miles east of San Francisco. The Altamont Free Concert would feature performances by California-based bands Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and the Rolling Stones. But the site was horrendous to organize. The logistics were chaotic, and once the music began, the gathering quickly spiraled out of control. What was meant to be a celebration of music and freedom descended into dysfunction, culminating in a homicide that would stain the Stones' legacy and mark one of the darkest moments in rock history.
The one story that I wanted to touch on and probably missed in the interview here is there's the Altamont concert. I mean, talk about a way to end the 60s on a bad note. That concert, what do you think the motivation was to do that? Because that was ill-fated from the moment the planning started, it seemed.
Yeah, it was all done at the last minute. And I think it was a well-intentioned idea, mainly by Jagger, to do a free show. And there had been one 5 months earlier in London at Hyde Park, which had been completely trouble-free. And they played in front of 300,000 people in London. And the British Hells Angels were sort of the security in the London show. Now, the British Hells Angels and the San Francisco version are two rather different beasts. And I think the British guys tended to, still live with their mums and dads and go home to tea. And, maybe at the weekend they dressed up a little bit and went out on their low budget, motor scooters and emulated what they thought of as the motorcycle culture. The San Francisco guys were a little bit harder core than that. And, and they were loaded, some of them. The myth that they were officially hired to be security is a myth, is another Rolling Stones legend. There was never a contract or an agreement. I think beer was the main exchange mechanism. And they said, someone in the Stones organization said, you can have access to this beer, but, keep order as well as best you can. We don't want anyone on the stage, for instance. Well, and again, saying to the San Francisco Hells Angels, here's a truckload of beer for free. And, we want you to, act as stewards on this, is really asking for a certain amount of grief. And they got it. And it was overcrowded. It went on really long and late. The stage was badly constructed. It was very low. There were a number of other problems. And of course, there was a tragedy in front where Meredith Hunter, who was just watching the show and maybe was influenced by drugs, waved a gun around and for whatever reason and was brutally killed more or less in front of the stage. So it was a shambles. It was a terrible tragedy. And as you say, almost symbolically, it was in December 69, rounded off the 60s. What was significant in the longer term was, I think, again, it taught the Stones, and particularly Mick, never to do anything that they weren't fully on top of. And the idea that you could throw a sort of festival together, hippie-like, in a few hours, and it'll be fine because everyone will be mellow and no one will hurt anyone else, and it'll be love and peace. I think that was the last time they really went for that particular promise. And from then onwards, it was always going to be a much more structured, much more organized beast. And, that's what we have today. So it was a turning point for the Stones as much as for the culture.
Interesting. Did I read in the book? I seem to recall that there was rumor that there was a hit on the Stones for years after from the Satan's Choice guys. Is that true?
Well, yeah. I mean, there were those in the Hells Angels who thought that they'd been badly treated by Jagger, particularly, because he went on in later interviews to say that they were really the cause, the agents of all this trouble. And some of them didn't care for being portrayed that way.
Yeah.
So when they were rehearsing in 75, so this is nearly 6 years later, the Stones were rehearsing with Ronnie Wood for the first time at Andy Warhol's house on Long Island. And there was a beach, of course, behind the house. And there was concern that there was going to be some kind of amphibious landing. It sounds very improbable, but that there was going to be a sort of pirate mission of Hell's Angels landing in small boats on this beach in the middle of the night to take out the Stones. And I don't know that it ever actually amounted to anything. But there's files in the FBI, for instance, that say they wanted more security because they were alarmed about this possibility. I think peace has been restored in the 50 years since then. But there was a period where he was not on their wish list.
By 1970, the Stones had learned some hard lessons from the Alan Klein fiasco. Determined to regain control, they launched Rolling Stones Records, securing better rights to their music and partnering with Atlantic Records for distribution. But the fight with Klein was far from over, a legal battle that would ultimately stretch 13 years. Despite their legal efforts to claim that Klein deliberately misled them, including the rights to their songs, the courts ruled that Klein ultimately retained ownership of all pre-1970 songs, including the massive selling Hot Rock's Greatest Hits collection. With no alternative but to push forward, in 1971 they headed to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, legendary for its Southern Soul productions, to record the album Sticky Fingers. Released in April 1971, the album was an instant sensation. Its iconic Andy Warhol cover, complete with a working zipper over a man's crotch, turned heads as much as the music itself. The album sold 22 million copies and delivered classic tracks like Brown Sugar, Can't You Hear Me Knocking, and Bitch. The album also continued the Stones continuing to dabble with country music. Keith Richards had become friends a couple years back with Graham Parsons, former member of the Byrds and country rock pioneer. He and Keith bonded over country music and drugs, and Parsons' influence can be heard on tracks like Wild Horses and Dead Flowers, adding that country flavor to the Stones sound. Meanwhile, the financial chaos left behind by Klein demanded radical solutions. Enter the mysterious financial figure, Prince Rupert, who Mick Jagger had brought in to right the ship. And Prince Rupert devised a bold plan.
Well, the first thing he did was to advise them to take at least a year out of the country to register as tax exiles, which is how they came to find themselves in France in 71, 72, with all that entailed. I mean, exile on Main Street is the obvious artifact that came out of that.
You described the scene at Keith Richards' home on the French Riviera, Villefranche-sur-Mer, the mansion, that was the town, and Villa Nelcote was the home. You paint a picture of that place that's absolutely out of the rock and roll handbook of what a party place would be. Can you describe for the audience a few of the weird things and wonderful things that were happening in that sort of exile stage?
Yeah, it was pretty chaotic. I mean, I've never been there, but I've interviewed people who were there, survivors, if you will. And it was
That's
pretty
a good
chaotic.
word.
Yeah, they were survivors. It was pretty chaotic. You had this absolutely beautiful, idyllic estate overlooking the sea, and you can imagine the south front, the Riviera in summertime, gorgeous, and Keith had a private beach, he had a speedboat, he had all these cars at his disposal. And of course, you had heroin, which was freely available in Toulouse and Nice, among other places, which are just down the coast. So you put all those things together, you got a pretty combustible. You put Keith, money, and drugs in one package, you usually get some fireworks. And there were some. There was the moment when, for instance, Keith had an argument with the harbor master in the local village about a little parking dispute. Keith's parking technique over the years has been random at best. And he left his car where it shouldn't have been. And the harbor master came out to remonstrate with him. And Keith immediately seized a toy gun belonging to his, I think then 3-year-old Marlon, his son, and waved it very injudiciously at the harbor master. Well, French harbor masters are equipped with real guns. And the man pointed his revolver back at Keith, and it took some speedy negotiating by other parties to calm the situation down. Otherwise, everything post-exile we may never have heard, because it could have been the end of Keith. There were several instances like that. I mean, there was another one where they tried to wake Keith up one evening to come downstairs to record in the basement of this beautiful house. And I think they were very apprehensive about waking him up in those days. You never quite knew what mood he would be in. Finally, someone bravely went up to Keith's room, which he shared with Anita. And thank God they did, because they found that the bed was engulfed in flames. And of course, he'd nodded off with a cigarette of some kind, or shall we say tobacco of some kind, in his hand, and the mattress was beginning to burn. Wow. And so they managed to put that out and extract Keith and Anita from the flames. And there were a number of instances like that. And I think Mick has often said that he much prefers to separate his home life from his working life. And you want to go to a studio, work, cut whatever you're doing, and then go home again. Whereas in this case, it was all under one roof. And I think the divisions got blurred between work time and play time. And there was a lot of hanging around, a lot of waiting for Keith, which is ironic because he actually lived in this house. And yet he was still the last guy to appear for the sessions.
Yeah.
And, Wyman was quite funny on that subject. And I remember Bill said, sorry, one final thing he said, Bill said that, he said, normally you want to know when you're playing something in the studio, kind of what direction you're going. He said, I had no idea what the song was, if it was a song, what the title of the song was. A lot of it was just jamming. And every now and again, the engineer or the producer would say, okay, I've got enough now, we'll cut this, we can make a song out of this.
Yeah.
But it was sort of formless in a way. It was just musical, and they would cut it into pieces eventually and polish it up. And that's what became Exile. So it was chaotic in the recording, and you can hear some of that even even on the vinyl today. It's either a flawed masterpiece, total chaos, or just brilliant, maybe all of the above. But that's how it was recorded.
And really, their backs are against the wall. They're broke at some levels. They're in tax exile. The house that you described, the basement, sounds like Dante's Inferno.
Yeah.
Of humidity, and like it's absolutely oppressive down there. And even the state of the house, was it not? I mean, is it true that it was what it was previously? Like it was the headquarters of? I think the rumor is that the Nazis used it as some sort of a office. Is that true?
I don't think that is true, actually. It's a good story, though. It's one of those Stones legends. I only say that because it turns out that the Nazis did not occupy that particular part of France until very late on in the war. And there's no evidence that they actually physically lived in that house or commandeered that house. But it's a great story. And I mean, you know, print legend is the way to, you know, approach these stories. But I do think you make a good point. The house was really a shambles, and it was a sort of billionaire slum by the time they left it. And one of the things was it was so hot, physically hot in there, and they had no air conditioning, that of course all the instruments would go out of tune very quickly. And if you listen to something like the intro to All Down the Line, you'll hear that it's a wonderful riff. I mean, fantastic, but it's out of tune. And I think they just left it like that. It's not out of tune in the sense that you wince when you hear it, but a musician will immediately say to you, "That's wrong." You know, they shouldn't be playing that.
So that's part of that ramshackle sound you talk about.
It's part of the charm of the album, is that they left certain things on it, whether they had to or they just decided to. That you know, an engineer today, let alone a computer system today, would have rejected as substandard.
Also on the Exile on Main Street album were songs like Tumbling Dice, Happy, Sweet Virginia, and Shine a Light.
The 1972 tour that ensues, it sounds like, I mean, to continue the image of the Stones, this is like the nonstop drug and alcohol fueled carnival that travels from town to town. It's just unbelievable circus. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was about 2 months long. It was pretty crazy, certainly. And one of the images I always like to think of was they couldn't get the plane from, it's either Seattle, where I am now, to Vancouver, or was it vice versa? I think it was going north from Seattle to Vancouver. It's about 120 miles. And of course, you have to go over an international border, which is pretty laid back, or at least until recently is a pretty laid back border crossing under normal circumstances. You just, you know, you tell the guy where you're going and how long, and you're on your way. But their plane broke down. So they had this entourage, they had this convoy of a dozen huge black limos. You can imagine some smoke billowing out of the windows, were the ones with the musicians, and God knows what else was being smoked. And suddenly this entourage presents itself at the otherwise tranquil border crossing at the Peace Arch that separates Washington State and British Columbia. And you can only imagine the reaction of the sort of one lone guy on duty in his hut there, confronted with this absolutely insane cavalcade, Mad Max-like convoy of crazy vehicles and smoke and God knows what else. And somehow he nodded them all through, and they actually got in. But I don't know why, that just always amuses me, that image. It's indicative of the arrangements of that tour, which it was the last one I think they ever did, where they still, sometimes they would give a show and at 11:30 at night, they didn't have a hotel room booked, partly because many hotels were reluctant to take anyone called the Rolling Stones, and partly because it was just a shambles in that organizational sense. So, you know, you'd have the manager, Peter Rudge, frantically trying to get them into the Holiday Inn at midnight. And you can again imagine the night clerk's reaction as the Rolling Stones arrive on his premises. And it had that chaotic rock and roll feel to it, of, you know, making it up as you went along. And I think it was probably the last major tour they did that had that spontaneity to it. It
sounds like like the chaos backstage, the drugs and the roadies are high, and like it's just chaos.
I think, and yet, you know, the Stones have always been very professional when it actually comes to the 90 minutes or the 2 hours where they have to deliver the goods. And there was a story on that tour where Stevie Wonder, who was, believe it or not, the support act, pulled out of one show. It might have been in Detroit, basically because his drummer had had some kind of collapse. I think it might have been drug induced, but the drummer couldn't play. And so at the last minute, Stevie Wonder pulled out of that slot that particular night, and the Stones were furious. They said, "Well, you know, drugs have never stopped us. We, we, we've gone through way worse, stuff than that. And
Yeah.
still, and their ethic was very much, you get screwed up and yet you perform.
Right.
And you have that 2 hours out of every 24 where you have to be on. And that's very much their reputation to this day. And I think that's one of the reasons we're still talking about them 60 plus years later. And they've still got that iron core in the heart, that self-discipline.
The golden era of the Stones that everyone cites is that 68 to 72 period. What was it about those 4 albums, that sort of period? Why did the Stones, how did they come to that peak or that classic period? Was there, the Beatles were gone, there's some, or is it just they were maturing as songwriters, the sound, Mick Taylor arrived? What do you think were some of the reasonings for that being cited as their golden run?
Well, I think 2 words you mentioned that Mick Taylor are pretty important. He was obviously a virtuoso guitar player that Brian Jones might have been had he persevered and kept going and developed as a guitar player, but never really did, quite apart from the tragedy of his death. Taylor brought a new dimension to the Stones that they didn't have, and you can hear his influence all over those albums. Not Beggar's Banquet, admittedly, but the Let It Bleed Fingers and Exile, very prominent lead guitar parts. And, you listen to him doing Sway, for instance, on Sticky Fingers, and then listen to them doing it, which they periodically do now live. No disrespect to Ronnie Wood, who I like and admire, but it's not the same beast. He doesn't have the tone or the touch. Whatever it is, he just doesn't have that fluency that Mick Taylor had. So I think they were very lucky or smart to get him when they did. There was a maturity of songwriting that was, beginning to peak then. They'd been doing it, Mick and Keith, for about 5 years by the time they got to Banquet. And that's usually, if you look at the history of classic rock bands, usually after about 5 years, it's either really happening or it's falling to pieces, or it has fallen to pieces creatively. And for them, it was happening very much so. And improved technology was a factor. I mean, it sounded better, although you'd never know that from Exile. And the other two words that are really important are Jimmy Miller, the producer. He'd worked with Traffic, for instance, and he got an introduction through them, through Chris Blackwell at Island Records, to the Stones. And the Stones were sort of drifting a bit in 67, 68 after Satanic Majesties. And I think Miller was smart enough to bring them back to the roots, and yet give Mick and Keith enough leeway to, embellish and write the sort of material they were then interested in, but to keep it grounded in the blues and the roots. And, Bill Wyman says that Miller would often stop a session and say, yeah, this is good, but where's the groove? Where are we going here? Where's the real story? Where's the song? And, this was something that other than Ian Stewart, no one else would say to them, Mick and Keith. And they'd been used to, in total non-interference and just writing more or less what they felt like. So I think Miller gave them that discipline. He knocked a few heads together in a benign way. And I think you've got a combination of him, Mick Taylor, maturity, natural evolution of songwriting, and, better recording techniques. You put all of that together and, you've got a pretty strong package.
Some fans count one more album in the Stones' classic run, 1973's Goat's Head Soup, which gave them the #1 hit Angie, and tracks like Do 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 Heartbreaker, reflecting Stevie Wonder's influence from their 1972 tour. It's Only Rock and Roll, released in October 74, kept the momentum going. By 1975, a major lineup change would happen. The first one since Brian Jones' exit shook the band. Mick Taylor left, and Ron Wood, a former guitarist and bandmate of Rod Stewart in the band The Faces, stepped in, marking a new chapter in the Stones' history.
Why did he leave the band?
I think there were a number of problems going on. One of them was his health. which is a euphemism basically for drugs.
Mhm.
And he's admitted as much. He was going down a dark path at that time. He joined them when he was 20. He was a vegetarian, teetotaler, never smoked. And he
Wow.
left them 5.5 years later. He was in poor shape.
Yeah.
And say what you will about the Stones, particularly Mick and Keith, they've got the inner apparent strength to take all this stuff, certainly Keith, and yet come out of the other end, still function. Not everyone is lucky, is as fortunate or as resilient as that. And I think Mick Taylor was on a path to self-destruction, and he realized that. And I think there were frustrations about songwriting. Moonlight Mile on Sticky Fingers, we just mentioned, is a song I think he thought he might have well got a credit for, among others. And finally, it was just becoming harder to work with the Stones in around 74. I think there was some talk about whether they would tour again. They had visa problems in the US at that time. Believe it or not, they were still regarded as, this is the sort of late Nixon, early Gerald Ford era, still regarded as subversive, anti-American troublemakers who would stir up the kids to go crazy in the streets. And they were having trouble even getting to work in the US. The albums were taking years to record. And I think Mick Taylor was frustrated and bored. And he thought he could do better and more stuff. Whether he has is another matter. But I think a combination of all of those things.
Right.
And he just wanted to go solo. It's a pity in retrospect, he may think this, I don't know, that he couldn't have got a solo career going in parallel with the Stones. Bill Wyman was doing much the same thing in 74. He released his first solo album, and it may not have been a great piece of work, but at least it gave him a focus and something to do during the, interminable delays getting Keith out of bed and, Mick motivated. But Mick Taylor didn't or couldn't follow that particular road. It's a shame. It would have been great if Taylor had stayed and developed with the Stones, but we'll never know.
Next, the Stones crash headfirst into the chaos of the late 1970s of New York's infamous disco, Studio 54, soaking up the glitter, the gossip, and the pulse of punk and new wave, sweeping the late 70s. Could they remain relevant in the face of these new sounds? Out of that musical cocktail of punk, new wave, and disco occupying the song charts in the late 70s comes the Stones' 1978 album Some Girls, brash, restless, and impossible to ignore. The title track stirred controversy, with Mick's provocative roll call of women from every race and nationality. Then there was Miss You, a swaggering disco groove, and Beast of Burden, a slow burn plea of love, and other new wave influenced tunes that proved the Stones still had some tricks up their sleeves.
You mentioned Satanic Majesty's album. They were roundly criticized for being too reactive to, I guess, music trends, psychedelia in that case. The Beatles had done Sgt. Pepper's. They then go on that famous run we just talked about, straight ahead rock and roll, 68, 72, Jimmy Miller, Mick Taylor, and beyond that. But then 10 years later, in sort of 77, 78, they veer again with the album Some Girls, almost with a disco dance influence sound. But this time it seemed to hit the right buttons, that sort of veering away a little bit. Why do you think that one landed and sort of, Satanic was just over the top?
Well, I think Some Girls is a bit of a mixture, I always think. I mean, there is obviously that disco. The title song is famous or notorious for being that four-to-the-floor disco beat. But there's a lot of other sounds on that record. There's a little bit of the punk, if you will, ethic in there as well.
Yeah, that new wave
when the
kind
whip
of sound.
comes down, respectable maybe. I always love Shattered. It's a great song, I think.
Yeah.
So they mixed it up on that album. But I think it was, it's a great record. We're talking about Some Girls. It's a great record in its own right.
Chris, the song Miss You from Some Girls reached #1, and also a top 10 hit was Beast of Burden. That album did really well, reaching #1 in the US charts and #2 in the UK.
But I think one of the reasons it did really well, and Tattoo You, 3 years later, also did really well, it marks the beginning of the Stones as survivors, as in it for the long term, the really long term. And there's a point where a band comes out of the starting gate, usually really brash, exciting, brings about, most of its fans are the same age as they are. And then there's a second era, quite often, where it's sort of embarrassing. And quite often a band loses direction, and, they repeat themselves in ever decreasing audiences. And sometimes it ends there. In a few cases, there's a third act where they manage to recover some of the early promise and the early initiative, and yet run with it in a way that is, friendly to an older audience, and encompasses different styles, has an ear to what's going on the radio at the time without slavishly imitating it. And I think the Stones, particularly Mick, were smart enough to see that was the way forward. That they had to adapt. And also the stage show had to adapt. It had to become much more of a spectacle and a family entertainment than it had been up until then. And I think the late 70s, maybe 81, is the turning point. The Stones, and everything since then has pretty much been an evolution of that turn. The last 40 years have just developed that basic idea.
As the Stones rolled into their third decade, they kicked off the 1980s with Emotional Rescue, delivering the funky title track and the icy bite of She's So Cold. A year later, in 1981, came Tattoo You, featuring Start Me Up, a riff-driven anthem that began life years earlier as a reggae jam. The album also gave fans Hang Fire, Little TNA, and the soulful Waiting on a Friend. Both of these albums, in 1980 and 81, showed there was no stopping the Stones in their third decade together, as both albums finished #1 on the Billboard charts.
You've mentioned a few times that Mick was, particularly Mick, you've used those words, and the relationship between Mick and Keith, we touched on it a little bit. Keith in his book cites the fact that Mick really carried the show, not carried the show, but carried the business side of things in the 70s, while Keith was really struggling with his heroin addiction. In fact, Keith even writes in that book that Mick was looking after Marlon in hotel rooms and getting him a hamburger and these kind of things. So Keith was really out of it. Mick is kind of taking the reins. And it just has me wondering, as the 80s start, Keith is more, is back in the game a little bit off his addictions. And the Glimmer Twins, as everyone, referred to them, they have a bit of a rift. And what do you think that was about, and how did they resolve it?
Well, I think it was about their different personalities. They're no longer, tied by the demands of daily gigs and the crazy life, of having to record, immediately go on stage, back to the studio, back to the hotel, living like a sort of gang almost, completely joined at the hip. I think once that pace slowed down a little bit, and in Mick and Keith's case, they had enough money to indulge that, some of their natural differences, I think, surfaced. And as we were saying earlier, you've got one who's Mick, very organized, efficient, and hates to be idle. I know this for a fact. I mean, has to have a plan every day he gets up. What am I doing today? And Keith, who's quite happy to sit in a hammock or lie in a hammock for 3 days, smoking something and, looking at the Jamaican sunsets. And I think some of that went into the clash, into the problems they had. One of them wants to work. The other one likes to, but isn't compelled to do something every day. And then you've got musical differences. I mean, it's a cliche. I know it's thrown around to mean everything. But I think they did have some musical differences in the 80s. And some of those are evident on Emotional Rescue on the album. I think Mick wanted very much to follow the sort of the disc, Bee Gees, if you will, sort of, or Saturday Night Fever even sort of vibe. And Keith is, let's not do that. We've made our name doing what we like to do and what we're best at, which is basically adapting the blues. And we don't need to be fashionable or trendy. We're the Rolling Stones. Other people follow us. We don't follow them. So there was a certain amount of that. And, middle age, you've got families coming into the picture. You're no longer a 19-year-old kid with no loyalties or commitments other than your music. You have kids and lady friends. So all of those went into the problem. And I think what brought them out of it, basically, in one word, was money. I mean, I'd love to say it was the, creative imperative or the deep felt need to make music and to push society's boundaries as they once did. I think what really happened was Prince Rupert and one or two smart, middlemen managed to convince Mick and Keith that they could package their tours from now on in a completely different way than the old days. And they're
cutting out the local promoters, basically.
Yeah, there we go.
Here's a band that literally followed the Garage to Stadiums playbook from sweaty London clubs to the biggest stadiums in the world. And by 1989, the Stones start to complete their transformation. With the 89 Steel Wheels tour, they didn't just fill stadiums, they redefined how rock and roll tours were run. Gone were the patchwork of local promoters who handled local promotion and ticketing in return for a cut of the gate. In came mastermind Canadian concert and events promoter Michael Cole, who sold them on a bold idea. Take total control and think bigger than anyone before. The gamble paid off. From August 1989 to August 1990, the Stones stormed North America and Europe, raking in a staggering $175 million. It was the dawn of the Stones' stadium empire, where every tour since has pulled in hundreds of millions and have led Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to amass fortunes nearing $600 million each.
I mean, cutting out the middlemen, essentially, and really heavy on accessories and merchandise and the expensive gear and everything that goes with it. Ticket prices in the three figures suddenly, and I think when Keith, who claims to disdain any kind of commercial, interest, sordid matters of money, but I think when tens of millions of dollars were beginning to be mentioned as a payday, I think his ears picked up, and he's never declined a check that I'm aware of. So he was quite happy to go along with this new master plan, and I think that's what brought them together in '89 with Steel Wheels. Record was, in my opinion, adequate. It's not a great album, but it's enough to say we're back. And the tour became the template for every tour that's taken place since then, not only by the Stones, but by a lot of other classic era rock groups as well.
Yeah. Let's take the jukebox back on the road kind of thing and play the hits. Yeah. The let's do a little game here. I want you to the current lineup, there's obviously people have left the band, but that sort of 80s Ron Wood, Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts, Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, of course. 5 words or less. Let's describe each man. Jagger. Start with him.
Focused, driven, single-minded.
Richards.
Laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, maybe laid back. But is this maybe more than 5 words? Laid back, but with enough common sense to see which way the wind is blowing.
Very intuitive, yeah. Let's go to Bill Wyman.
Bill Wyman, solid, respectable, somewhat withdrawn, insular, but reliable, trustworthy, and always there when you need him.
Charlie Watts.
Charlie Watts, enigmatic.
Rest in peace, Charlie Watts.
Yeah, rest in peace. What a guy. Enigmatic, taciturn, quiet, withdrawn, understated, elegant, and brilliant.
I like it. Let's touch on Ron Wood. We haven't touched on him. He replaced Mick Taylor. What did he bring to the band?
Flamboyant, adequate, technically, musically adequate, but irresistible as a personality. and a sort of a Dr. Kissinger type, brings people together, sort of an intermediary. So he's been very important as the glue who's helped keep the Stones on the road the last 30 or 40 years.
We're nearing the end here, Chris, and you've really enlightened us on the dynamics of this band. What will the Rolling Stones be remembered for? What's their place in music history? Some young person stumbles on the Rolling Stones 10 years from now and says, man, and then someone says, these were the guys that blank. What will they be remembered for?
Came up with some fantastic early songs that still sound good today, maybe better than they did initially even, and were smart enough and self-disciplined enough to evolve into what we now call, excuse me, sort of a package, an entertainment package, where they take some of their early spark and market it in a way that is friendly to all ages and all groups. And you can go and hear at least a glimmer, to use a word, of what they were initially. So they've cleverly repackaged themselves as a sort of nostalgia, touring nostalgia group, but also that gives you these tantalizing glimpses in the middle of a Midnight Rambler, for instance, or Give Me Shelter, of what they really were when they came out of the gate, which was sensational. And I think they're unique in that sense of having both the young and the old ages so cleverly covered. So, you know, they've run the gamut.
Very well put. Here's the hardest question you're going to get, or maybe the easiest, I'm not sure. What 3 albums would you recommend the audience dive into to get a sense of the Stones if they don't really know the music?
Well, if you'll pardon me.
Maybe you'll...
Yeah, I've got a visual. This is, I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah.
But signed by dear old Charlie.
Nice.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, and I
England's newest hit makers.
I show that not just for the Charlie autograph, but because the first album was, I mean, some of it's pretty crude and badly recorded, and they did it in this little basement in London, which is still there. But, you know, it was done on a wing and a prayer. But it does have that early sort of grit to it and that spark. And you've got 5 really enthusiastic guys who don't know if this is going to be their only album, and they're giving everything. You know, who knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah,
they're putting everything into it. So that's got a lot of promise. That's got a lot to say for it, the first album. And then I think you have to move forward to Let It Bleed, which is a different proposition, obviously, but it's got these wonderful songs. It's true to the blues. You can still hear the 5 guys who were in the basement 5 years earlier doing their first record. You know, it's blues rooted, and yet their songwriting by then has evolved into something much more sophisticated, much more interesting, and it's just seductive in a good way.
Yeah, and I mean, that's got Gimme Shelter and Midnight Rambler, Monkey Man. You always get what you want.
Monkey Man, I think you could do a lot worse if a Martian arrived and said, what's one song, you know, what's this fuss about the Rolling Stones? You could do worse than play Monkey Man.
I love that tune.
In my opinion. You know, it starts off with this sort of insinuating, starts off almost like cocktail music, but in a good way. Yeah. And it ends up with, it sounds like Captain Beefheart being sick or something, you know, with this crazy kind of vomiting sound. It shouldn't work.
Yeah, like Cold Italian Pizza or whatever.
Cold Italian Pizza is great. It's a great song. So I would strongly put Let It Bleed in the mix. And it would be a toss-up between Sticky Fingers and Exile. For the next one, personally, I'd go for Exile because it's got such a breadth of material. I mean, as with every double album in history, there's stuff on it you might ideally want to have left off.
Yeah.
But there's enough good stuff, great stuff on it.
We have an open...
Brilliant.
We have
brilliant stuff.
Yeah, it's a brilliant. We have an open debate in the offices across the stadiums because I fight for Sticky Fingers and others say Exile. I think Exile has, well, it's a double album. It has a lot of tunes that probably they stuffed onto it, and it doesn't, as you said, didn't sound as finished as otherwise. But Sticky Fingers, I don't think there's a weak tune on there.
Yeah. No, I'm a great fan of Sticky Fingers. It's a hard call. The first time I heard Sticky Fingers, I thought, you can't get a better record than this. I mean, this is whatever it is, 40 minutes of perfect rock music, which runs all these different styles as well. There's this old Fred McDowell, Mississippi blues, You Gotta Move, through to Brown Sugar, and Wild Horses is sublime.
And I'm glad you mentioned Sway, because I think that's an underrated tune.
Yeah. Sway is a fantastic song. So I would put Sticky Fingers and Exile almost in a bracket together.
Right.
But if you put a gun to my head, I'd just go for Exile.
Christopher Sandford is the author of The Rolling Stones. He did 50 years and has updated it for 60-year anniversary. And I have to tell you, if you want to understand the history of an important band in the pantheon of rock and the dynamics of the personalities that basically invented a lot of the rock sounds that we hear, took a lot of the R&B stuff, but then made it their own. This book is a really entertaining read, and will give you a sense of that history and their importance. So I want to thank you today, Chris, for joining us. It's been highly entertaining to hear your perspective.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It's been a pleasure.
And now for some closing notes on the Rolling Stones. A staggering 1.5 million fans watched the Stones perform at Copacabana Beach gig in 2006, making it the largest rock concert ever. Ever wonder how Rolling Stone magazine was able to name their magazine when an existing rock band already had the name? Well, in 1967, Jan Wenner launched Rolling Stone magazine in San Francisco. As soon as Mick Jagger saw the magazine using the band's name, he threatened legal action. The negotiations ended with a settlement granting the Rolling Stones shared ownership of the UK version of the magazine. But the venture in London was soon mismanaged, and Wenner took back control, ending the band's brief foray into publishing. Mick Jagger's father, Basil Joe Jagger, was a fitness enthusiast and physical education teacher. He was also a gymnast and helped popularize basketball in Britain. He certainly left his influence on his son, as Mick is known for his fitness, including running and ballet training, which he maintains to prepare for tours. Sporty Mick actually appeared in a documentary on rock climbing at the age of 14 on the British children's series Seeing Sport, which we'll include on our website. Keith Richards was long rumored to have had a full blood transfusion to kick his heroin addiction. In 2010, he was interviewed on CBS News and admitted that he had invented the rumor himself. He was arrested in 1977 in Toronto, Canada for possession, and as part of his sentence, he played 2 shows for blind children in the Toronto area. He claims the judge was lenient after hearing a story from a blind girl who Richards had helped get into a previous Stones show. Richards referred to the girl as his blind angel. Director Martin Scorsese has used the Stones' Gimme Shelter in 3 of his films, including Goodfellas in 1990, 1995's Casino, and The Departed in 2006. Did you know that the Rolling Stones promoted breakfast cereal Rice Krispies in a 1963 commercial? As we mentioned, Start Me Up on the Stones' Tattoo You album began as a reggae tune years before. The entire Tattoo You album was made of older songs from the Stones' archive that had previously never been released. With 3 top 20 hits, 9 weeks at number 1 in the US, and over 4 times platinum in sales, the Rolling Stones turned reclaimed studio scraps from their archives into Tattoo You and one of their best-selling albums. The cake on that cover of the Rolling Stones' 1969 album, Let It Bleed, was baked by Delia Smith, who later achieved fame with her UK cooking show. She later recalled it was in response to a request that was for a gaudy cake that had to look really horrible. Despite the horrible cake, Smith was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, in 2009 in recognition of her contribution to television cookery and recipe writing. Andy Warhol gave the Stones one of the most unforgettable covers, 1971's Sticky Fingers, a bold close-up of a man's crotch complete with a working zipper. Rumor had it the body was mixed, but he always denied it. Iconic? Absolutely. Practical? Not so much. When it was stacked for shipping to retailers, the weight of many zippers damaged the vinyl records. The fix? The zippers were half zipped down so that they rested right at the label at the center of the record, where no record grooves could be harmed. One of the cameramen in their 1970 documentary, Gimme Shelter, which chronicled the chaotic Altamont Rolling Stones concert, was none other than legendary film director George Lucas of Star Wars fame. The film captures the stabbing murder of Meredith Hunter while the Stones were playing Under My Thumb at their infamous Altamont Free concert in 1969. It is often referenced as the unofficial end of the hippie era. Mick Jagger was knighted by Prince Charles, now King Charles, in 2002 as Sir Michael Philip Jagger. Keith Richards felt it was hypocritical of him to accept it, since the band had always been critical of the British monarchy and English law. Perhaps Queen Elizabeth felt the same way, as she was unavailable that day due to scheduling conflicts. Originally, Sympathy for the Devil did not mention both the Kennedys, but after Robert F. Kennedy's June 6, 1968 assassination, Jagger darkly revised the lyric live, immortalizing their death in rock's most sinister anthem. Thanks for making Garage to Stadiums one of the top 5% of podcasts in the world. We'd love for you to follow our shows on your favorite podcast platform so you can be alerted when our next episode drops. Follow us for some great music history content posted on our social channels, Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Our YouTube channel has additional bonus coverage from our interviews. Visit us at Garage to Stadiums for more bonus content on all the bands featured and links to great downloadable playlists on Apple and Spotify. Special thanks to our guest today, Christopher Sandford, author of The Rolling Stones, 60 Years. Thanks to our producers, Amina Faubert and Connor Sampson, our program director, Scott Campbell, creative director, Chad Raymond, and video director, Nigel Campbell. You've been listening to Garage to Stadiums. I'm Dave Anthony. See you next time for another Garage to Stadium story.